Hello, welcome back to the podcast series. And today I am delighted, actually very delighted, to be joined by Andrew Bengry, who we're going to talk about quite a few things. We're going to talk about your time as a New Age traveller. We're going to talk about festivals and also work you've done around intoxication, um, which is probably going to be quite a familiar subject for quite a lot of people watching this, I suspect. So, hello, Andrew,
Hello.
and thank you for coming along. It's lovely to see you. Um, So yeah, I normally start these things. Indeed, I always start these things really by talking about upbringing. So, do you want to talk a little bit about growing up, with perhaps with reference to anything you think might have prodded you in the directions you went?
Okay. I grew up in a sort of what I see as quite an ordinary working class area. I went to a working class school, and I had quite traditional working class parents. My dad works in a factory. My mom was a nursery nurse, and I felt my life was quite constrained. And I grew up not really knowing myself, just going through school, the same as probably everybody does, just trying, make friends at school, trying to fit in at school, trying to, do, in some cases do as well as you can, or, just to make the most out of it. And I suppose for me, my first sort of interest in anything beyond that was encountering people walking around with pink hair and walking around with blue hair, and me just being fascinated by these people. I was a little bit too young for that sort of first wave of that, but there were people who were older than me that I saw walking around who were different to me, and I became sort of more interested in finding out about things that were outside of my view, became, just started to talk to people and got interested in just what I saw as sort of, I don't know, just alternatives, other ways of thinking, other ways of being. And I suppose the thing in terms of, me, I went through, getting more and more involved with local people, meeting local people, starting to go to travel to other places, starting to get outside of my local town more, going to visit people in other places. And I'd also been brought up with my parents going out camping as well, which I think was a big part of. So for us growing up, and again, this might be the same for a lot of working class people, camping represented something about getting out of an urban environment and getting into a more rural environment, spending time around trees, spending time, sort of close to the ground, actually sitting around fires in some cases, and getting away from an urban environment. So, I suppose I became interested in festivals and that lifestyle. I can really remember being away on a holiday once with my partner at the time, and having this thought about, having to come back from a holiday and that
Yeah,
returning back to your mundane life, and this idea of how holidays were operating in our lives as well as ways of escaping for our lives. So I had this sort of idea about what would happen if you never came back from holiday, and what would happen if you incorporated holidaying into your life, and what would happen if your life became more like a holiday, and how, and I was, and I'm quite interested in this idea of sort of, for me, I felt this real need to escape from the life I'd been brought into, and perhaps the life my parents were leading as well. I didn't want to live their life. I didn't really know what I wanted to do, but I had this strong urge to escape, find and to explore something else. And I was looking for something as well. I think I was really looking for people that I felt I could connect with, because I felt quite, at school and stuff, I felt quite alienated and like, not able to fit in so well.
I think it's interesting that you didn't mention music there because most people's kind of point of entry is probably getting into like punk bands or whatever.
Mm.
But you were talking more about just people.
Yeah, no, I was interested in in music, and music played a big part in, my growing up, and the lyrics, particularly of music, were very inspirational. All the usual sort of crass bands and all that. I was very interested in what people were saying, but for me, the people were the important thing, and that's that sense of, I suppose, wanting to connect with people and meet people that I felt I connected with, because when I grew up, I had a strong sense of not feeling that I totally connected with people, connected with other boys, perhaps particularly. I think there was a thing of like going to a working class school that was quite a hard environment where, you know, you had to be quite hard to be able to get on. And if you weren't, then it was very different. You know, you could negotiate that with humor and, you know, playing, messing about and being the joker kind of thing. But, you know, I did feel, I suppose I was really looking for a sense of connection with other people. And I really enjoyed that sense of community that I got from, you know, being, well, you know, bringing the music in, going to a gig where you felt like, God, these are my people. You know, this is what it's about. This is, you know, I feel I found my tribe or whatever.
Yeah, I really understand that. I think because the first time I kind of started hanging around with punk rockers, there was this big liberation. But like you say, you didn't have to be macho, you didn't have to be hard, and that was just such a kind of lifting of pressure. I think that kind of thing. So just to be clear, we're talking about Telford here.
Yeah, this is where, yeah, no, I grew up in Telford, which is obviously well, it's a funny place. It's a cultural desert. It's a very functional place, like a lot of these new towns. It's designed to live a functional life. You can buy a house relatively cheap there. You can get a relatively well-paid job, and there's lots of roundabouts to make driving really easily. You know, there's a shopping centre very close. It's everything about it is functional. And for me, growing up in that environment, my parents were very much part of that functionality. They, you know, it worked for them, it worked for other people in my family, and I felt a bit, well, you know, just I was wandering around in it a bit, just exploring it, this sort of strange environment, and it didn't, I found it really, really constraining. And for me, the pockets that I found of people that, you know, within that environment, I found there were some quite interesting people lurking, you know, the people with the pink hair and the blue hair and the green hair and in the funny clothes, when you actually talk to them, and then I found that, you know, beneath that surface culture was a really interesting, you know, sort of subculture of all kinds of different groups of people. And, you know, bizarrely, you know, Telford for me is something that, you know, I jokingly say about it being a cultural desert, but it's far from it. When you look beneath the surface, there's all kinds of things going on, and it's like that in all kinds of areas. So I suppose it was meeting those people, making new links with people, and just sort of finding my way around this new, you know, this new, which was for me is growing up a very new, exciting world. And
I think particularly Telford. I mean, I was very drawn to Telford because there was such a creative buzz in the kind of alternative community there. People just got a lot of things done. There was a lot of gigs, there was a lot of magazines, there was a lot, generally a lot of creativity, and it was way better than a lot of places. I thought that's just, which is how come we kind of know each other really, is because I would visit there, and yeah, it's quite an astonishing place, and it had a very different vibe to a lot of places as well. I think there was how do I put it? I don't know. It was just kind of really, really non-macho. Really kind of, to me, it appeared that, you know, women really were equal there and more involved in a lot of areas, which were still quite male-led and that kind of stuff, for instance.
Yeah, no, I think there was that within the scene, but it was in the context of this ultra bland environment, because, you know, if you go to Telford without knowing anybody there and you go and do a Telford town centre experience, it's a very bland thing. And, you know, that was sort of parodied very well at the time by some of the punk rockers who lived there. You know, Jay with his Ichabod Pooh character, he did a whole comic series about, you know, the blandness of the shopping centre, and, you know, signs, you know, have you spent enough as you left, you know, sort of this whole commercial. So it was within this, I think that played quite, you know, I think it is quite interesting, because that was one of the things that I had a real dilemma. It wasn't until the sort of Telford scene started to sort of fall apart a bit, really, and people started to move to other places, that I myself decided to move on from Telford, because up until that point, it had, had a really thriving scene, and loads of people creating and organising things as well, which was because obviously, you can have people who are consuming, you can be part of the audience, but you've also got to be, the people who are making the things happen and up on the stage as well. And there was a lot of bands, I think, people, a lot of fanzines, a lot of, I don't know, it just seemed, I don't know why really. I'm not sure, because as I say, to live there, it was this also this really ultra bland, sort of toy town type space with all these funny little houses that were, all built to be cheap and affordable and stuff. So it was, and a mix, a place that had been built around more established old mining villages, because it sort of Telford, I think it was built in the late 60s, but it swallowed up a load of other little places and then became this, like Milton Keynes and Warrington and lots of places.
Yeah. So when are we talking about here, when you started thinking about leaving, and how old were you?
Oh, blimey. I would have been in my early 20s. I had been involved in a youth arts centre, Lime Street, which was basically a project that I joined. The committee was in existence before, and it was a campaign to get a youth arts centre running, and to pull together a lot of these different groups of people who were doing things independently. We had some very good youth workers, and that's, I think the thing that's quite interesting about Telford is because it was a development area, there's quite a lot of investment in Telford, so you were able to tap into streams of money if you could be, and so we were able to tap into something called the Urban Aid Foundation, which we got a grant to pay for renovation of this chapel. We were able to get some funding from the Gould Banking Foundation, various people, all with the support of these youth workers, to bring in this money to sort of develop this art centre. And then that ran its course, and various people came and went, and we got to this point where we were coming to the end of the funding, and we were expected to be financially self-sufficient. And also the committee that was running this, people had, were quite burnt out, and a lot of people leaving, moving on. And it went through this process of just falling apart, really, where it's ended up ultimately with the council reclaiming the keys, then people breaking in and squatting it, and this sort of the whole thing just went, caved in on itself a bit, really. So for me, I'd had a lot invested in that, and a lot of the people that I knew from that were people like Sarah, she was moving, people were moving away. And I ended up feeling that, I don't know, just that Telford really hadn't got anything for me anymore. Because again, it was about the people. And as the people started to go and this project started to cave in, I was looking for something else. And I suppose I'd had an experience when I was younger where a friend of mine had taken me to a free festival, and I'd never been to anything like it in my life. He had a motorbike and he said, I want to take you to this thing, jump on the back of this motorbike. And we just drove off, and we went up. I had no idea where we were. It was somewhere around Bishop's Castle. It's a place called Cantling Stones. And the first time I went, we just disappeared off along this path that went off and off and off into the middle of nowhere. And then we just arrived at this place where there were all these funny little, there were vehicles up there, funny little, I came to know they were called benders, but little domes in the ground where people were living. And there was a load of people having a wild party in the middle of nowhere. And I can remember just being absolutely blown away by, that this thing existed, that this guy knew about it, and that there were other people coming, to this event. So I'd had experiences of going to those kind of things and being intrigued, really, again, for me, looking for a culture, looking for people, looking for something that felt authentic as well. I was really feeling like I was looking for something that just I felt was real and authentic. And I was just really intrigued by these people living in the middle of nowhere, having this party and actually being able to sustain themselves, and this idea of, you know, sort of living outside of society, and actually, you know, would it be possible to, you know, just actually, you know, go away on holiday and never come back again? And would that be possible for a working class person to do? Because obviously, if you win the lottery, or, you know, you come into money, then, you know, the option of doing whatever you want is available to you. But for a lot of working class people, the option of doing whatever you want is not available to you. So you're caught in this thing of having to generate, you know, money or whatever, and then go away on holiday. So I was really interested in just this culture and how people were living like it, and these events as well. I suppose these spontaneous events that people were producing themselves.
Of course, that's why people buy lottery tickets, isn't it? It's that desire
that you can be free, that something overnight will liberate you from the constraints of, and it's not, you know, I know it's not all about money, but actually money is important in a culture where everything's for sale and nothing's, you know, there's very little for free.
Yeah.
You can be.
What year is this then?
So this is, I suppose, we're talking in the 80s, really. I suppose I mean, I'd been to other festivals in the 80s. I hadn't been to Stonehenge. I didn't go to the Stonehenge festival. I was, you know, involved in the thing after the main sort of Stonehenge festivals, but I was going to other festivals during the 80s. So I feel like I had this and things as well, like Glastonbury Festival was very different in the 80s. There was actually a Travellers Festival on the edge of Glastonbury's festival, where it was a free event. You could get in and out of the festivals for free. So, you know, there was a crossover between sort of free events that were completely, you know, somebody just identified a site where it was possible to hold an event, and somehow, so, you know, these were the pre-runners, you know, this preceded rave culture. So this would have been the 80s. And then the time that we bought a bus ourselves was at the beginning of the 90s. So again, this was leading up to the sort of Castle Morton Festival, and, you know, we were at the Castle Morton Festival. And
so we've had the Battle of the Beanfield. That was one of the things I was quite curious about, really, which I've always thought of as a watermark in the lack of tolerance towards people traveling in vehicles and living in vehicles and so on. So it's quite interesting that you were doing all this quite a lot later than that. So how do you make the transition from just being curious about festivals to actually going and doing it?
Well, I mean, it starts off with you getting to an event like that, obviously, and having a horrendous experience in a tent, probably, and then just seeing other people who are so much better set up. And, you know, for me personally, it coincided. It was around the time that I was in a group myself, so I bought a van. And we had a van that we used for the bands, the Y band that we were playing in at the time. And we started going to festivals, you know, to play at, really. So we were going there, just taking all of our stuff. We knew there'd be a stage there. It would be a bit of fun. But it was very much, it felt that you know, for me personally, the vibe was very much bring what you expect to find. So if you did go to something, a lot of people used to go bringing something. So whether it was stuff to sell or stuff to, you know, music, to contribute musically, there was quite a, you know, it was a very productive space. And that I was fascinated by, you know, this idea that people would all just organize together to produce something just for the sake of it being, you know, trying to produce something good.
Yeah, there's still a lot of free festivals about then, was there?
There was still quite a lot of free festivals then. It was still possible to have free festivals. It was still, I mean, there was still a bit of a cat and mouse game. And for me, even though the thing that was quite interesting about it is it was very regional. So obviously you'd had the thing with the Stonehenge Festival happening in Wiltshire, and Wiltshire police were very, very strict around a festival. So if you think of something like the Castle Morton Festival, that was originally supposed to be held in Avon. It was supposed to be Avon and Somerset Free Festival, but because that area of the country were far more organised as actually dealing with gatherings, and it was very much like a cat and mouse game, that the way festivals worked would be, the aim was to get as many people as you could onto an area of land as quickly as you could, so that the police would just suddenly go, oh my God, all these people, what are we going to do? Whereas obviously, if the police were able to manage everybody, then that wouldn't happen. So the Castle Morton Festival was fascinating the way that happened, because it was supposed to be held in Avon and Somerset. There was a lot of traveller sites that were all parked up, and in a lot of cases, people wouldn't have actually got to that festival unless the police had acted in the way that they did. So what the police actually did is they evicted all of the traveller sites in Somerset and Wiltshire, and coincided all these evictions, which meant that lots of people with broken vehicles that perhaps wouldn't even have organised themselves, had no choice but to organise themselves and be on the road. So they got all of these people onto the road and then herded them over the border into Worcestershire. So there was these huge numbers of people in Worcestershire, and the event itself was so bizarre. It was almost as if it was organised by the police themselves, because you went into Worcestershire, you were driving around, and there were police everywhere, but they were directing people who looked like they were in any way travellers or might be going to a festival. They were all directing them along a separate route. So they directed everybody onto Castle Morton Carman, where it then turned into the biggest festival that there had been since the Stonehenge Festival. They reckon there was over 10,000 people at Castle Morton, and but it was actually the police who directed everybody onto that part of the site to start with. So,
you had a double-decker bus.
yes.
I am absolutely enchanted by this. For two reasons. Firstly, Cliff Richard and Summer Holiday, where they do the bus up and drive off to Greece. And secondly, the double deckers, the children's show.
Yes, of course, yeah.
Where their headquarters was a double decker London bus, as the song goes. And in fact, one of the actors in Double Deckers lives here in Lewes. So
really amazing.
Yeah. Anyway, yeah. So I'm completely enchanted by this idea of living on a double decker bus.
Yeah.
So I'm consequently curious about how that came to be. I mean, where on earth do you buy a double decker bus? How do you drive it? All sorts of stuff.
It's really bizarre how, and I don't know if the rules are the same now, but this would have been sort of early 90s, so I don't think that much would have changed. Basically, up until that point, we had an old ambulance that we had been driving around in, that we painted up with. It was actually covered in pink multicolored spots. So it was a black ambulance with loads of multicolored spots, and we got the Planet van or something painted on the Y band. So it was very much this sort of psychedelic, ridiculous ambulance that we drove around in. And we've been to a few festivals in that, and we've got a little stove in the back of that and a bit that we could make into a bed. And it was enough it was more comfortable than a tent. And, you could have a few people in there when, sitting down, and then it turned into a bedroom at the night. And I had been intrigued by what people were doing with vehicles, because something like a bus, if you take all of the seats out of it, it's a big space, and you can petition it. And and I saw people that had done amazing things, where they were using, like they put in water pumping systems. This one guy had a proper functioning shower in there, and I was just really impressed by it. So I can remember, well, at the time, I had a partner who was self-employed as a candle maker, and she was running this small business. And we had this idea, because one of the things that I suppose I was a bit nervous about was how we were going to be able to afford to do it. How do you just, give up? Well, because what we effectively did is we just gave up our flat. Well, we bought jumping about a bit here, we saw there was a vehicle auction place that was not far from where we lived on the edge of this commercial estate, and I used to just go past it quite often and just look at some of the vehicles that were in there, and I went past it and saw that there was this double-decker bus there, and because I was young and stupid and I just thought, wow, that's a double-decker bus. Wouldn't it be great to own a double-decker bus? So I went down and talked to them, and they said that they wanted £2,000 for it, which was quite a lot of money at the time. And I hadn't got £2,000. In fact, I hadn't got anything, I don't think, at all. So I sat for a bit, and I went past and I saw it was there, and it just kept being there when I went past. And I went, I can't believe, I spoke to my dad, and I said to my dad that me and my partner were thinking of setting up a traveling candle business, and we were thinking of going around different events and selling candles, producing them downstairs, and we would stay in the upstairs. And would he be willing to lend me some money to invest in this vehicle under the this traveling candle business? And he wasn't very keen. And I sort of lobbied him a bit, and eventually got a loan from him that enabled us to go and buy this vehicle. And I was, I literally just bought it. It was given the keys and drove it from there to where we were living. And there was some parking spaces just at the back of where we were living, and we just parked it there. And so at the time we still had a flat, and we parked this just huge double-decker bus there, which, obviously I shouldn't, at that point in time, the bus had no tax or anything, so I was completely shouldn't, and I'd never driven anything like that before. I'd seen people drive buses, so I knew you had to swing out a bit when you went around the corner, so I knew the principle of it, but I'd not driven it. So we drove it back home, and then we had this sort of idea of doing it up before we went off in it, and we'd only had it for quite a short time when it was broken into, and somebody set fire to the downstairs of it. So we had to deal with all this being burnt out, and the windscreen got cracked, and we had various things that we had to sort out. So we eventually got over obviously that was upsetting, got over that and started doing it up. And we converted the downstairs bit to this workshop where my partner was going to be doing the candles, and then the upstairs into a living space, and into a basic living space. And then once we disappeared off in it, we carried on, doing it up as we were moving about. So
it must have been terrifying driving something like that without any experience.
It was terrifying, but it also felt, and this is just the ridiculousness of youth, it felt very exciting as well. And it was terrifying. And then, but I was amazed by things that we could do. We went, because when we first got it, it was registered as a public service vehicle, which you needed a PSV license in order to be able to drive it. But I was able to go to some motor vehicle registration office, and I got it reclassified as a mobile home. So it was once it was classed as a mobile home, I was then able to drive it on a normal car license. And you could drive up to, I think it was 10 tons at that time on a normal car license. So again, I have no idea if this is still the case. So once it was classed as a mobile home, it was no longer classed as a double-decker bus in terms of what you could legally drive. So,
and you've got some photos of said bus.
I have got some photos of the bus somewhere, if I can find one. Yeah, the best. Let me see if I can. Okay, let me just. Sorry, I'm not.
That's all right.
Okay, it's not a great picture of it, but I don't know if you can see.
Yeah.
So this is a double-decker bus. It was it was originally a play bus. You can see this is quite early on. This was at Castle Morton. You can still see the fire damage. This bit where the window there was fire damaged, but this
Right.
was at Castle Morton. And we'd also damaged the roof as well, because there's something about obviously having a double-decker bus that, yeah, they're taller than your average car.
So, I was going to say about this. Yeah, when you turn into a road and it's got a bridge or something.
And I had quite funny. Oh, I've had a number of, because you had to be aware of how tall it was. So obviously you did have these occasions where you'd be pootling along and you would come to a bridge and you would just know that you couldn't go under it. So there were certain places like Hereford, for instance. I had to try and get through Hereford, and Hereford's almost completely surrounded by railway lines. So we had an absolute nightmare. And we got pulled over by the police, and it was at a time where I don't think the vehicle was completely road legal. So I got pulled over by the police. I had to run up to, I went running up to the police, and the first thing I did is ask them for direction because we were completely lost, completely distracted them with giving me directions, and then they just sent us on our way without doing any of the vehicle checks that they would have normally done.
Close one, yeah.
Yeah.
Wow, it looks really, I have to say, completely inspiring. I would say.
Yeah, no, it was. I was very inspired by it at the time, but I think it, because I think this is the difference between free festivals then and like raves now. That, they were connected, and Castle Morton was very much a point where there was rave areas, and there were Spiral Tribe had their own thing going on there, but there was also stages with bands playing as well, so you had the two things very much coexisting at that event. But I think the thing it became harder and harder to hold events that went on for more than just one day or one night, because of the Public Order Act that I think it was in 1994, around that time, and they changed all of the rules. Well, it's after Castle Morton that they changed the rules after Stonehenge, and they tried to stop it, and they changed the rules after Castle Morton, and they tried to stop it. But then I think last year there was a really big 3-day tech festival in Cornwall that went on. So I think it's one of those things that people still, despite it all, you've only got to find a bank holiday where, in an area where, the Tories have done loads to help with this kind of thing by cutting the numbers of police, because in reality, it is this cat and mouse game where a group of people organise something. They sometimes, somehow manage to do it in a way that the authorities don't get wind of, and they get a lot of people onto an area of land before anybody can do anything about it. And then, and you hear, at the time, you would hear people use language like, who's going to take the site? And it was very much like a sort of operation. And it felt, quite exciting to be part of that, to be part of this sort of spontaneous event, or that was generate, because something like Castle Morton, when we were driving around just looking for this event, we just got told that there was a site in Worcester that people were heading towards. So it was very much like lots of people on the road driving around, not knowing where the hell they were going, knowing that there was supposed to be an event happening, and then you getting snippets of information that somehow led you towards whatever it was. In some cases you would drive around and some things didn't happen. You just get to a bit where there was loads of police blocks and loads of miserable faces, and it didn't happen. But when it did, it felt that you were part of, well, a different world, really.
That different world. I'd stopped going to festivals, I would say, by the time that the whole kind of acid house thing happened. And then because I presume that kind of changed the nature of festivals, and perhaps even traveling to some extent, when all those people came on the scene, because it was a very different scene to the kind of more hippie punk thing.
It was a combination of factors, really. I think, if you go back to, throughout I think the thing about festivals is they raise really interesting questions, because they're quite like deregulated spaces a little bit, that, they're a space that people claim a piece of land, once there's lots of people there, all kinds of different things happen there that perhaps wouldn't happen in other spaces. Obviously, there's the drugs that, people consume at festivals and at rave scenes. There's just the culture is more unregulated. So I think that raises problems, because from my experience, is I've got some really good memories of festivals and people having wild times, but I've also got some bad memories of festivals where things happened that nobody dealt with. And I think it raised questions around, anarchy, around autonomous spaces, around what happens when, if you claim a space and you set it up as an autonomous space and people can do whatever they want and you have freedom and you liberate, say you think of it in terms of liberating a space. I think Hacking Bay talked about temporary autonomous zones as these spaces that become autonomous because they're somehow liberated and held for a while. If you think about it in those terms, it raises questions about what you do in those spaces and how you enjoy those spaces, how you use those spaces. And for me, sometimes the way that people use those spaces was great. You'd feel really positive, but then other sides of it, particularly, I don't know, I think as well as there being people who chose to travel, there were also people who ended up almost like itinerants because of things that had happened where they were living. So there were people on the road that had to move out of places because they'd basically been run out of town for things. There were people, so there was criminal that, not being judgmental about, there was theft that went on between people. There was heroin use, there was really serious drinking, there was people that, their lives were just about begging and drinking. And there was just a quite a nihilistic aspect to festival culture as well, that was just about hedonism. And the thing, it raised questions about, and this for me, particularly when, it became more of a lifestyle, because the way that things like the peace convoy, the way that came about, and the way that New Age travelers came about as a cultural phenomenon, was about people wanting to stay on the road. They would buy a vehicle, there would be a whole series of festivals across the summer, so you could go from one festival to another. People realized they could make money making and selling things at festivals. You could buy a load of ingredients, make a load of cakes and sell them at the festival, and you could make money. So it became something that, rather than just going to an event, it became possible that it became a lifestyle. But then if it becomes a lifestyle, it's then how does it sustain itself? And it just, for me, I think, in some ways, I think the festival scene burnt itself out and generated there were problems within the culture as well that made it easier to attack it from the outside. So for instance, like, if at the end of a festival like Stonehenge Festival, there used to be loads of burnt out cars left on site. There were, I lived on a festival site where a load of people pulled onto the site because, they're open spaces. You can't control them, so anybody can come and live there. There was a site that people had been living in Wales for ages, and they'd even got a post box set up where the local postman would come and deliver mail there. And people from the local community, there was a baker that used to drop bread off at the end of the day if they didn't sell it. They were quite an established group that were accepted by the local community. And it all changed when a group of people turned up there who were heavy drinkers, who used to drink really heavily in town, and one of them pissed in the local supermarket, up one of the freezers. And it wasn't like a big supermarket, it was a tiny little Londis in a little Welsh village. And, the fact that they were wandering around the town being all loud and leery was upsetting people anyway. And after that, the whole site got evicted, and and it had been there for years. And I think it was, for me, some aspects of festival culture was really difficult because there's no, when, it's the idea of anarchism, really. It relies on everybody working together and cooperation. And if you've got people who aren't working together or are doing destructive things, how do you deal with that, and who deals with that?
Well, I was just about to ask, how did you deal with it? How do people
Well, I
deal
think
with
you deal with it sometimes as an individual. You get individuals that sort of step out and deal with things, and sometimes things don't get dealt with. So, there was a festival I went to in Yorkshire where, I knew somebody got really badly beaten up there, and all of their tent was set on fire by a group of people that some situation where they had been renting a property, a group of people had been living in there, and they'd stopped paying rent, and they'd been evicted, and they had encountered this person who owned the property at this festival, and they basically beat this guy to a pulp and set fire to his tent and smashed all the windows in his car. And lots of people walked around really upset about it. Stood around going, oh no, this is really heavy, this is really bad. And it was that kind of stuff that actually, how do you deal with those? It's like at gigs as well. It's like fights at gigs. Who deals with those things, and how does the community protect itself? Because I think, there were, as well as it being an idealistic space, there were also things that happened that sometimes were quite scary. People that were really, really drunk that had got also, out their face on glue, that had just split up with a girlfriend and was going around with, I remember one guy going around with an axe, smashing into people's vehicles. And, it's just that chaotic side of a free space is difficult.
It's the elephant in the room, isn't it, really?
Yeah.
How do you deal with having no police, essentially?
Yeah, no, completely. And what do you do when there's a really dangerous, because, historic, there was a big event at, I'm trying to remember which year it was, at Glastonbury, where I think it was the last year they had the Travellers site. And basically at the end of the festival, they wanted the people to move from the site because they wanted to start tidying up, and the Travellers refused to move, and there was a big battle with security where there were Travellers armed with cleavers, and it was really like a full-on battle. And it's that side of, well, about when you take the police away, who deals with stuff? And, because I've had times in my life where I've been really glad when the police have turned up because nobody else was dealing with things. And I think
absolutely, they've got quite a thankless job. I mean, they're not without fault, obviously, but I think looking back, I think there was a lot of naivety about all that, truthfully.
Yeah. And I think it ended up where, you read back into the history of it, there was a lot of sexual assaults at festivals, there was a lot of violent assaults at festivals, there was all kinds of things happening that people either weren't noticing because they were all being hedonistic and full of the parties, full of the party, and they're not looking at what's going on behind them, or they didn't know what to deal with it or how to deal with it. So I feel like, for me, it was, and I think the other side of it that's really, because I think things have changed obviously now. There's not, laws have changed that make free festivals. There's less of them. Free parties are very, moments of intense hedonism until, the police come, party till the police come kind of things. And then you've got the mainstream events that have become more commercial and, a context where people are, very consciously creating experiential environments that are tied to brands as well. So that, you go there and particularly, it's gone back to being Reading Festival, but there was a period where Reading Festival became the Carling Weekender. And, it was a celebration of Carling and Tea in the Park was,
probably not the best festival in the world.
No, but so you had this real strange overlap between these commercial events and people quite often would go to both. And then some of the, it's like Glastonbury now, a lot of the people involved in producing Glastonbury and Boomtown, a lot of those people are the same people who used to be involved in the free festival scene. And, people have got built, jobs now within festivals creating, well, because people obviously build these temporary spaces that people have a party in for a weekend. But it's what it means beyond that now. That's the question, I think. Is it just a moment of release that you go to a festival and you have a wild weekend and then you go back to it's less of a lifestyle now. I think it's very much about a bounded event where.
Oh, totally. I remember having a meeting with my accountant, who was a younger guy, and he told me he was off to Glastonbury, and I don't know, it just kind of really threw me. It's a bit like footballers with Mohicans or something, you know. It's quite weird. So what was the sort of transition out of living on that bus? What stopped you?
Oh, a series of disasters, really. I mean, there's something about the practical aspect of traveling around. I had the vehicle go, we had the engine seized twice. And it's, I think, I went into it full of the romantic idea of living and this idea of being able to take you home with you wherever you went, and that that sort of almost like the snail where you can just crawl around, you carry you home, and you can and at that point as well you could that's why a lot of people would, if you were classed as no fixed abode as well, once you gave up an address, you're classed as no fixed abode. That opens up opportunities in terms of you can sign on absolutely anywhere if you're unemployed at that time. So I had been living like that for a bit. The vehicle we had, the engines. We had a stupid thing that was. I knew a little bit about mechanics, and I perhaps kidded myself at the time. I knew more than I did. And there is obviously something about, whilst it might be a great, exciting idea to buy a double-decker bus, there's the some more practical issues of obviously where you park it and getting under bridges and stuff like that. But also, what happens if you get a puncture? What happens if the engine breaks? And we had a thing where the bus was losing power, and you just kept putting your foot down, and it would just go slower and slower. And I didn't know what it was. And we ended up with the bus. We were going up a hill, and it just went slower and slower and slower, and then just stopped. And we found out that the engine had seized completely. And it's not like a car engine. It's a 10-litre engine that was the full width of the bus. It looked like a traction engine. It was astonishing. And it was completely seized. And what had happened is it had overheated, and the engine was complete. So I ended up, this opened up another chapter in terms of just how amazing people can be, because I ended up in this broken bus on the side of a motorway. I had a friend at the time who towed me off, who was with a group of people that we'd been traveling with, and towed me off onto a bit of land. The downside of that is the person that I was in a relationship with at the time actually went off with the guy that towed us off in the bus. So that was the last I saw of her. So that was obviously didn't work out too well. Yeah. But then I had this job of fixing this bus, and I had no idea of where to start. And I knew from the past, talking to people who, I'd had a few conversations with people who drove buses, who would talk to me about buses, and I ended up going to the local bus depot. I was actually in Brighouse up north, and I went to the bus depot in Halifax and got talking to them, and they were just really, really helpful. And they offered to lend me a manual for the engine that I had, which was like, why on earth would complete strangers lend some weirdo a manual? But they lent me a manual, and they said, if you need any parts, give us a shout, because we can get them cheaper through the bus station. So I lent this manual and started stripping this bus down. I ended up in a situation where I hadn't got loads of the tools. So I talked to a garage down the road, and this garage lent me loads of tools to do this job. So I ended up completely stripping this engine down and following this manual, going backwards and forwards between this garage and the bus station, asking them questions about things to do, feeling terrified by the whole thing because I'd never done anything like that before, but put it all back together, and it started. And I was like, whoa, amazing. So I thought, that was, and, I had really, was really blown away by the fact that these people had been so helpful to me without any reason to be. And so I went about my day, and very soon after, the bus started losing power again. and we had a similar experience, and the engine seized a second time. So it turned out that the reason it was actually seizing was, again, this is something I didn't know. But buses don't, so without getting too boring, they don't have a standard clutch system. They have an oil-filled clutch, and basically, as the engine turns, there's a fan inside that apparently is moved around by this oil, and it has to be filled with oil. Now, ours had been losing oil because the seal that had basically, the person who'd done this, so before I bought it, apparently these bolts had been, that hold this seal down, were about that much too long, and they were not sealing it properly, so it had been leaking oil. So I eventually fixed it by just sawing the end off these bolts, and it clamped it up. But it you know, getting to that point where I sawed the end off the bolts cost me nearly £2,000 in terms of
what you paid for it, of course.
Yeah, which is what I paid for it. And I'd had no money at the time, so I'd gone through a long period of just getting money and having to pay all of this, and I was so, oh, I don't know, I just got fed up with it. It went from being something that was like a lot of fun to something that was a load of hassle. And then I was just, I think, why the hell have I bought a double-decker bus? Why haven't I got a normal sized car? And then also as well, I think the nature of festivals and the nature of that lifestyle was changing. It was becoming more and more difficult just to find somewhere where you could just be and park up, because obviously in a context where, well, they brought in rules where they said more than, I think it was more, I can't remember the number of vehicles now, but it was, you know, a very small number of vehicles would be classed as an illegal gathering. So anywhere that you parked up, you almost immediately got people asking you to move on. So there was nowhere that you could park up and be okay. Even in cases where people owned their own land, they would say, yeah, you can park on my land. They would then get the council or the police putting pressure. We ended up on a situation, we found a place where a farmer was very happy for us to be there, but the local police told him that they were going to prosecute, they were going to take him to court for holding an illegal gathering on his land. So it all became very difficult. So it went from something that was, you know, just felt like an escape to something that just, or felt like a, you know, sustainable thing, to something that was, I don't know, I felt very marginalized, felt quite alone, a bit disillusioned with it as well. And also the commercial, well, you know, free festivals were getting fewer and fewer. There were the occasional free parties, you know, whilst I, you know, like the ethos of the free parties, you know, and I liked some dance music, it wasn't the same for me. For me, I liked, you know, the stages, I liked the bands, I liked the crazy, you know, all the crazy combination of things, you know, just a few speakers and people dancing around wasn't quite enough for me. So that didn't have the same appeal. But
so you work for a university now, yeah?
Yeah. Yeah.
This is kind of connected.
Yeah.
Or some bits of a certain, because you were saying just before we started about doing projects about festivals and intoxication and
stuff. Well, I came out of my time in that sort of festivals, living like that, with just feeling just a bit lost about what I was doing and what I wanted to do. And again, I knew, in terms of my background, I come from quite a working class background, and I knew I didn't want to just go and get a job somewhere. And I was quite interested in reading, and I'd always been quite interested in reading. And a lot of the people that I was reading books by, I saw that some of them, I used to really like reading Robert Anton Wilson's books, and he had got a PhD, and I started thinking, oh, this is interesting. This is, you know, and I was quite interested in this idea that you could do something that you were interested in and study something that you were interested in and make it into, oh, I don't know, something that sustained you financially. So I just thought that, so I went and decided to do an access course, and then I went and did a sociology and psychology degree and enjoyed that. I did a couple of projects I was working as a youth worker, and I was working with some lads that were stealing cars, and I was really interested in why they were doing this. And there was one in particular who has he'd been to court and he was told that if he stole the car again, he was going to prison. And within a week of going to court, he stole another car. And I was in this role as a youth worker, and I asked him why he did it. And he just started telling me about the type of car it was. And he said, yeah, but have you seen them? Have you ever driven one? He said, they're amazing. And he was just really interested in this vehicle in a way that he had been so compelled to drive this vehicle that he was going to go to prison for it. So I became interested in masculinity and motor cars. So I did a project on joyriding and masculinity because it was all lads that were stealing cars. And I did a number of projects linked to I did a project on, I went on to do a master's degree, and I did a project looking at what was called the cruise scene, which was basically boy races where they were all gathering outside Halfords and McDonald's and this whole modified car scene. And I did a couple of projects about modified cars. And then I did a PhD, which was about car modification and masculinity. And then I got a project working on I got a job after that working on a project which was about young people and drinking and about the meanings around intoxication. And then after that, I worked on a project about music festivals. So the thing that I think is most relevant for me, the project about intoxication was really relevant. And then the project about music festivals, well, it was about music festivals and free parties. And it really tied into, I suppose initially I was really passionate about the festival project, but I became so sick of them at the end of it. And the thing that I suppose, I saw it really raised questions around what is freedom about, and what do we do with freedom, and because, you know, we live in a culture, you know, despite what people say about it and moan about it, we live in a culture that is relatively freer than other cultures in the world, and we can pretty much do what we want. And I suppose these projects for me really raise questions around, because when I talk to people at festivals, and when I was working on that festival project, a lot of people talked about them as just times in their lives where they could be themselves, and they talked about them as times of freedom, times of escape, times of but what they actually did when they went to those events, you know, being themselves was just about getting off their face and being entertained by music. And I suppose it really raised these questions for me around, what do we do with freedom if we get it?
It's interesting, isn't it? Because you're saying, you know, they get an opportunity to be themselves, and the first thing they do is stop being themselves by getting out of
Try
it.
to stifle themselves, to sort of smother that. But it is interesting in terms of what we do with that, you know, those spaces. And, you know, because a lot of people talk to them as you know, places of escape, in the way that I'd felt that they were when I was younger. But then, having gone through that whole process and become, you know, sort of more cynical about it, I feel like it really raises questions around, because, you know, will it be anything other than just a way of, you know, is it any different to, you know, going to Ascot, or or going to Henley Regatta? You know, is going to Glastonbury any different to that?
So you've talked a lot about, you know, things raising questions. Did things also raise answers? Is it any different to going to Henley or Ascot?
It has the potential to be different. I think there's something different about free events where anybody can access them, and you potentially have just a group of people who are there because, you know, they want to be there. And I think the thing that I find difficult about events like Glastonbury is, I mean, it's 300 and something pounds it is for tickets this year, and, you know, whilst you're there, everything is like it's double what you would normally pay. So and you go there now, and it is full of wealthy middle class people who are having a jolly, and, you know, experiencing a bit of alternative culture for a weekend. And it feels, it doesn't, you know, for the people who are involved in producing it, a lot of the people producing it are still, you know, people who've been part of the festival scene for years. So the culture is maintained through the production of the event. But in terms of the people who go to events now, I just feel like well, it's become really niche. Obviously, there's loads and loads of different kinds of events, like rock events and dance music events and reggae events and whatever kind of events. And I don't know, festivals for everything, sort of chess festivals and dog walker festivals. It's sort of everything has a festival. But I think the big events themselves, I mean, I'm not taking away people's experiences because they're amazing. You can have great times at a festival, and the people organising them know that, because that's why Carling sponsors festivals, is because they know that people will link their experiences with the brand that's tied to it. So there's still amazing spaces, but I suppose I don't know what they mean, apart from being, is it any different to a holiday now?
Yeah, I can't help putting my situationist hat on here and thinking about commodification and recuperation
Yeah.
and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
It seems to me precisely what's happened. Glastonbury, of course, being a great example
Yeah.
of that. Yeah, I mean, when you were talking about Glastonbury having a travellers field, the other thing that I remembered was that the fence around the outside, you could literally step over it, as
Yeah.
I did in various years.
Yeah. Yeah. Completely.
And now it seemed quite symbolic when they built that big Berlin Wall type thing all around it, I guess.
It was
And
terrifying though, because when you
uh,
and they have like people on Land Drivers driving round in between two walls, so it was it
there'll be
was no
gun towers.
exaggeration to say like a Berlin Wall. It was
Yeah,
impenetrable.
yeah, yeah. It's kind of weird, isn't it? And it's part of a wider thing as well. I think, like for instance, charity shops. When Oxfam went from just being little old ladies with piles of dead men's suits to sort of something far more swish and clean and organized and commodified. Ultimately,
True.
it's a part of a bigger shift.
Yeah. Yeah,
So
no, definitely. So I think, I don't know, perhaps I'm just grumpier, because for me it's about authenticity. I was looking for authenticity,
yeah,
and wanting something that you felt was sustainable. I didn't just want a weekend away. I wanted something. So I feel like, and maybe there are still people who are part of events. I'm sure people who are involved in organizing the free parties and things, and people who are part, because those things do still happen. So they don't. You only get to hear about them when they go wrong, really, and people get caught for things. But they do still happen, and people don't get to hear about them. Or so there still is that culture, but it's just what it means.
is it? I don't know if you know this or not, or if it's a fair question in that respect, but is it still a feasible lifestyle to like live in a van or a bus or whatever?
Oh dear, that is a good question, because I think at the time I really thought I was part of an alternative lifestyle, and I did sort of, and it's. I think there's a one, Leo Wilde talked about self-othering, which I thought was a really interesting idea. This idea of distancing yourself and making yourself different to everybody else, and it really felt like it was, something that was sustainable. But the elephant in the room was a lot of us were signing on. A lot of us were as dependent. We were all shopping in the same shops as everybody else. We were as much part of the culture as anybody was. And I think we just sort of thought of ourselves as different, but we were as just I don't feel like, I think that people have actually are experimenting more in there's communities that have set up where they're more sustainable. So I think there's something about that lifestyle which, well, traveling, driving around in vehicles is, a lot of those vehicles were not very well maintained. They really bad in terms of exhaust emissions, environmental impact and all that kind of stuff. It's maybe that's not sustainable. There's the thing about even tidying up after events and things like that. Who tidies up after a free festival, and who tidies up after a rave? There's a lot of infrastructure that sort of people just put themselves forward in terms of volunteering, and so it's. I mean, I think it has the potential to be sustainable, but I don't know. I don't know whether I don't know. I don't know whether it'll always just be like these moments of, that temporary space where you liberate a liminal space where, just people escape their lives for a moment and then they go back again. I don't know.
Do you think it's the two things, van living as it's probably known now, and festivals, are they kind of inextricably linked?
Um, they were, in the sense that there were people who lived on the road that the reason they lived on the road was because they were part of the festival culture and they would be on their way to a festival, or they would be parking up waiting for the festival season to start, and they would travel from event to event until there were until it got to a point where there were no more events. And then some of those people, I knew people who traveled off and went abroad, and particularly in Europe there's a different attitude to traveling. So a lot of people who were the more together people went off and traveled abroad. There were it seems like it was a thing a bit like me, dipped into it for a bit until you encountered some problems, like for me, the engine seizing and was a really big deal, especially when I became disconnected, because when I split up with my partner, I became sort of a bit isolated. So I think, it's like all groups of people. When you feel very part of them and supported by them, then it can be great. But if something happens where you feel a bit disconnected from the group, then the group can sort of carry on without you a little bit. So I feel like there's the potential for a community to, and I feel for people who are involved in the scene still, there's, a strong sense of community.
I'd like to go completely off piste to finish with, and ask you about the candle making business, actually. I'm absolutely fascinated by this idea that you can just kind of make candles, sell them, and make a living doing that. Is that did that happen?
Sort of. We had times where it worked, and but there's so many things you don't realize until you live like that. Like you can use post office boxes, and have stuff delivered to post office boxes anywhere in the country. So you can go into a post office and say, is it possible to have something delivered here? And they will give you a post office box number. So we used to be able to get materials ordered. So we had sacks of wax delivered wherever we were in the country to local post offices, and we would go and pick them up. We did market stalls. We had a little one of those market stalls that you put up, and we would produce and box stuff in the bus, and we supplied some shops when we went round. So we would go into the local village, find some shop and ask if they would start stocking your candles, and we would supply them through mail order. And it works a bit, in the sense that we were making some money, we were doing it, but it wasn't it didn't prove to be sustainable, in the sense that we ended up where we were just making hardly anything. And there's a whole issue around, yes, you don't have the same overheads when you're living like that, but you have practical things as well, that if you need to produce a load of candles and you need to melt a load of wax, then you need to know that you're not going to be evicted in 10 minutes or something. And there's practical things about stuff like that. So I feel like, for me, I like the idea of having a mobile business. I like the idea of not when we started, we didn't want to just go into it and sign on and be begging and like you do see that's the way some people sustain themselves. That was so not what I wanted to do. And I had this idea, well, it wasn't my idea, my partner's business, but between the two of us, we had this idea that this could sustain us, and it potentially could have done, but well, our relationship caved in for a start, which was not so. That was obviously tied up with the business and then the practicalities as well. But yeah, no, I think it's interesting, this idea about being static as well, because obviously most of us live in the same place. We go off on holiday and we come back to that same place, and what I suppose I did, when I lived in that way, is I realized that you could, well, if you come up, I'm sure now, if you came up with a really good idea, people I met more traditional travelers, and their whole lifestyle was based on their knowledge that you could go to a certain part of the country and you could buy something really cheaply. You could go to another part of the country and you could sell it and make some money. You could just move around and use your knowledge of where you could get things. And it's like, well, there's lots of things that people pay all kinds of money for. As if you just move, you can go and sell, you can go and get loads of Army and Navy stuff and next to nothing, and probably sell it in some boutique in London and some designer, alternative wear or something like that. And so I still think there is potential to travel and have a sustainable life, but it depends on the context, because obviously there's been points historically where, again, after that Castle Morton Festival, after Stonehenge Festival, because, they were huge events that lots and lots of people, and, a word of a mouth of event, and an unregulated event. So from the point of view of the authorities, they're probably quite scary. That 10,000 people just congregate through words of mouth, and they're not going to go. They're going to stay there and party till the police come or something. It's probably, well, it's certainly, there have been times where the Conservative Party got very, there was some very dramatic speeches where I think there was a "not in this age, not in any age," and this sort of medieval brigands, and talking about travellers as the enemy within, and all this stuff. So there's been times where they've been people, living. Well, I suppose you don't know who people are as well. If somebody's no fixed abode, you don't even know if they're using a proper name. There's the thing about anonymity, because obviously if you have an address and you're tied to that place and people know that's where you are and that's who you are, then you're very grounded in, obviously, if somebody's no fixed abode, then they could be anybody.
Yeah. That's quite an interesting point. I think that'd be a good place to finish, actually, because it's quite a lot of food for thought in that idea, really, that anonymity and the sort of good and bad of it, really, I suppose, the light and dark of it. Yeah. So yeah, okay, that's been absolutely fascinating. Thank you. There's lots of stuff I didn't know, I've got to say. So I'll keep chatting to you after I finish the recording, but for now I'd just like to say, Andrew Bengry, thank you so much for your time.
Oh, nice to talk to you. Thank you.